Today I'm not going to talk about the unions of artists, but I chose to enlarge our perspective on the geography of East Central Europe or Eastern Europe through a very interesting case study, which is that of Chilean Museum of Solidarity. I must say this is a very recent research I'm dealing with, so I don't have any powerful conclusions, just maybe some perspectives of reflection after the 2 days we engaged in. So during the Cold War, the cultural relations between the countries in the Soviet bloc and Eastern Europe were not exclusive. My presentation includes evidence from the collaboration of the European socialist countries with socialist countries in Latin America, Chile, Cuba, and Nicaragua, but today I will only refer to the case of the Museum of Solidarity. Through this specific case created in Chile in 1971 and which thereafter took different forms traveling the world, and then in 1991 returning to Chile. The argument my presentation makes is that the study of this kind of transnational and even transregional links during socialism can help redraw the geography of East Central European art during the Cold War. Based on this unique example of collaboration with artists from socialist and non-socialist countries, this presentation argues thus for this transregional approach for the understanding of the artistic landscapes of East Central Europe during the period 1945 to 1989, but with a focus on the 70s and 80s. I think contemplating this corpus of artworks that the museum collected from artists' donations, it's interesting to situate the so-called aesthetics of resistance they put forward during the 70s and 80s, and thus interrogate the regional East European canon of the time. So while resistance in Eastern Europe mostly encompassed abstract, modern, non-ideologized art in the South America, it frequently included ideological art or explicitly committed left-wing art. From the theoretical point of view, just to explain, these are the maps included in the volumes published by the museum about how their collections were organized. So they include the different links of the donations made by artists to the different regional funds of the museum. So from a theoretical point of view, I think it's important to stress how political cartographies are variable in agreement with the different temporalities we look at and with the discipline used to discuss them. So the socialist bloc, Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe can change their composition if one looks at a specific time period or on the contrary chooses another, as it can change if one is interested in the political regimes, as is my case, or in the artistic exchanges. So the main theoretical framework used in my presentation is that of the study of the relation between art and politics in dictatorships. That is an interdisciplinary, institutional, archive-based study of cultural policies in dictatorships. At the same time, a focus on actors and networks of actors, in this case, artists, curators, can mold certain national institutions, as the example of the Museum of Solidarity, I think, best showcases. As you already know, the interest for transnational approaches is manifest in several disciplines. The history of communism, as Bogdan Jakob showed, includes a look at different scales of understanding entanglements and circulations, as does the study of the Global South from a perspective of cultural history. Studying the supranational constructivist network, an art historian, Bendersky, argued for the importance of personal ties. Bogdan Jakob as well observed how the role of various individuals that cut across the various borders of communist regimes, be it institutional, geographic, or intellectual, are equally important. I think this aspect is paramount to the understanding of the Museum of Solidarity, how it was established both in Chile and in exile. So, in fact, what I propose is a mix of the institutionalist perspective with a look at the actors that created the networks. Other authors, such as Paul Boulan and Isabelle Guarnet, analyze how the global turn of social science and the humanities global history were connected and crossed at the same time. They remark how, since the years 2000, the social history of communisms has been affected by this growing influence, which has marked how we understand international communism by escaping any diffusionist vision focused on the Soviet state and its relays to focus on the circulation of people, ideas, knowledge, practices, models, and representations between socialist countries and with the West and the Souths in plural. At the same time, this transnational focus has been since in the 80s and the 1990s, especially in international relations studies. And in what concerns the study of communisms, the two authors I just quoted argue the transnational perspective has contributed to the dismantlement of the opposition between the East and the West, which has obscured the interconnection, exchanges, and cooperation between the two systems. So the history of daily communism and of daily practices have shown that local practices are the result of this kind of transnational circulations. At the same time as Bogdan Jacob, who is a Romanian author that discussed the transnational turn in studying communism, observed, this transnational approach to the study of communism can reconstruct the international dimension of the communist experience with its multiple geographies and spaces of entanglement and transfer and clustered cross-cultural identity building processes. He, in fact, underlines the trans-ideological transfers, the emulation and communication, and gives a series of examples of transfers between the pre-communist and the communist period, between the Soviet and the local regimes, regional transfers that were also discussed here, east to west, and so on. So seen from such an interpretative standpoint, institutions, values, historical actors, and events become the product of interactions that inescapably surpass the specific environment of local regime dynamics. As it was several times said here yesterday and today, art history that discusses certain currents or artistic trends has considered them in different countries in this kind of transnational approach. Although the tendency has also been to look at this from already established geographical categories. In line with the transnational history of art as proposed by Bazin, Dubourg, and Piotrowski, I, in this presentation, tried to look at the role played by a transnational institution, such as the Museum of Solidarity, in establishing a new geography of art exchanges. So I'm interested in the transnational history of arts with a focus on the role played by institutions, such as the Union of Artists, who of course established several kinds of exchanges between artists and the leadership of the unions, or in this case, the Museum of Solidarity. The Museum of Solidarity of Chile is perhaps one of the best examples of transnational and even transregional networks of collaboration, including artists, curators, and art critics from the Americas and Europe, while there are other examples that use the collaboration of artists, such as the Museum of Nicaragua or the Museum of Lodz in Poland. None of them goes as far as the Museum of Solidarity in terms of transnational links. Again, Bazin, Dubourg, and Piotrowski observed how surprising influences were possible during the communist regimes, such as that of the socialist realism from Western countries and not from the Soviet Union, so the bigger influence of socialist realism from the Western countries. And thus they discussed this complex circulation of objects, persons, and ideas, as well as the transactions between East and West through the Iron Curtain. In line with this idea of a transnational history of art, I would like to argue here for a transregional approach of the relation between art and politics during the Cold War and between the South and the East. I think the authors I just quoted also interrogate the utility of the category of Eastern Europe as a relevant supranational category in light of this desired communist internationalism and to the desire of the avant-garde artists to be in sync with what happened abroad in the West. Yet, if we study the communist regimes in Europe and regime in the Soviet Union compared to other communist regimes, there is clearly a difference that can be seen. And in this sense, the geographical difference is clear, I think. Piotrowski's study of art in Eastern Europe in a global perspective is thus a starting point of this analysis, as he proposes a project of comparative studies of geohistorical margins and marginalized cultures of the East and the global South, the far North, and every other part of the globe. There are several contemporary artists who have investigated in their art projects, this kind of transregional solidarity of the left-wing movements of the 1960s and 1970s, but I don't have the time to tell you about it. This study proposes a southeast and not west-east or southwest analysis of the constellations of transregional relationships as mediated through the institutional collaboration practices of the Cold War period. This is the letter of Salvador Allende to the artists of the world, inviting them to donate their artworks. So the Museum of Solidarity was established by Salvador Allende, who was, as you already know, the president of Chile between 1970 and 1973, on a call to artists of the world to donate their artworks for a museum of modern art for the people of Chile. And this is also known in the history of the museum as the period of solidarity, 1971 to 1973. Then, since 1975, in exile, it became the International Museum of Resistance, Salvador Allende, until 1990. In 1991, it was established in Santiago de Chile as the Museum of Solidarity Salvador Allende, and it still exists to today. It has a permanent collection and organizes temporary exhibitions. The museum, I think, remains up to today one of the most interesting examples of committed artists who collaborate to create a space for the popular classes to enjoy contemporary art. It was, in fact, established as a kind of anti-museum in 1971, as the basic notions of the museum were an assault on existing art museums, especially the prestigious and admired institutions of the metropolis. It questioned their geopolitical monopoly by calling out the absolute incompatibility of their social function and the principles of the artworks and artists in their care. The Institute of Latin American Art, which was established in 1970 at the University of Chile, and which also coordinated the Museum of Contemporary Art, helped the Museum of Solidarity at the beginning, as did the International Committee of Artistic Solidarity with Chile, created in 1971, which was presided by Mario Pedrosa, who was director of the Sao Paulo Biennale. And it was formed by curators and directors of international museums. So the first exhibition of the museum was planned to coincide with the inauguration of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD 3, which opened in 1972. In fact, the Solidarity collection includes artworks that supported the Chilean way to socialism, which was an ideological artistic commitment of 1972. This is the building which was inaugurated in 1972, and where the first exhibition was organized. The museum was reorganized in exile in 1975 and continued to collect artworks from artists and museums. The spirit of the museum, in fact, materialized through this nomadic existence. Artworks accumulated in people's homes and borrowed institutional storage spaces, and different fragments of the growing collection were shown in all kinds of venues during the 17 years of military rule, from festivals to international solidarity events. Murals and large-scale paintings were often produced in situ by one of the several international anti-fascist painters brigades made up of Chilean and Latin American artists in exile and their European collaborators. National committees for the museum were created in Cuba, Spain, France, and Mexico, in which prominent intellectuals took part, trying to rebuild the collection. The museum, established in Paris in 1975, in answer to the establishment of the dictatorship in Chile and under the direction of those that created it in 1971 and who had to go into exile, was to denounce the military dictatorship and to create new forms of solidarity. So a new decentralized network of support was created, and artists were invited to donate their artworks with an explicit political objective. Part of this effort were also events such as the Venice Biennale of 1974, which was annulled by its director, and instead was organized an event titled Freedom to Chile, with its center of attention on the International Brigade of Anti-Fascist Painters. And you have here some very badly displayed images. So the last part of my presentation concerns the link with the Romanian and Polish donations. The donations from the Eastern European socialist countries in the period 1970 to 1990 were, as the rest of the nations, under the coordination of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Chile, and they were received in Chile until the coup d'etat of September the 11th, 1973. The shipments were organized through the Institute of Latin American Art and the Chilean embassies abroad. There was also an international convocatory realized by ambassadors and cultural attaches that allowed for direct donations to the embassies. This meant the Solidarity collection was eclectic in terms of quality and importance of the artworks. There were more engravings and fewer sculptures because they were being transported with a diplomatic suitcase. Thus, in the initial period, through donations, the museum was able to collect over 700 artworks. Concerning the relations with the socialist countries in Eastern Europe, the albums of the museum register under the title "The Lamentable Loss of the Romanian Shipment." There was a Romanian shipment, according to the documents from the Chilean embassy, which included paintings and sculptures donated by the Romanian government and artists. But it appears it arrived in Chile and then it was lost. The Romanian National Archives have safeguarded a file in the Union of Artists entitled Donation to the Solidarity Museum of Chile. You can see here the cover of the file from 1972, which includes the list of the 6 artworks that were sent and short portraits of the artists, who were all quite well-known artists, such as Corneliu Baba, who sent a portrait, Alexandru Ciucurencu with a landscape, Constantin Piliuță with a woman singer, and so on. So Romania sent 3 paintings and 3 sculptures that were neutral in their thematic, and the accompanying letter states that the Romanian artists who are members of the Union of Artists, having learned about the call of the International Committee of Artistic Solidarity with Chile, for the creation on the basis of donations of an art museum of modern art, wanted to donate their artworks for this institution. The Polish sent abstract artworks for the international exhibition of 1972. And then at that point, it included works by Stefan Giersowski, such as Warsaw of 1968, Dominik Tadeusz with Kamienie of 1969. In fact, if we look at the statistical list of the donations to the Museum of Solidarity, it's easy to spot that Eastern European socialist countries were among the countries who sent fewer artworks than Western countries or Latin American countries. And in this sense, Poland is the country which is the most important among the socialist countries in Eastern Europe. So as I said, the artworks donated were quite eclectic, including paintings, sculptures, graphic art, photography, and were authored by professional artists, but also by amateur artists. And their topics are also very eclectic. So they are openly politicized and on the topic of the war in Vietnam or the Cold War, or very neutral, such as the case of the Romanian donation showed. In the case of Poland, we can see references in the archive of the Museum of Solidarity to the Polish Committee of Solidarity with the People of Chile, which was led by Edmund Jan Osmanczyk, the director of Museum of Art in Lodz, Ryszard Stanisławski, and the Ministry of Culture and Art of the Popular Republic of Poland. In fact, Poland was one of the first countries to establish a solidarity committee with Chile, and the director of the Museum of Art in Lodz was in charge of the selection of the donations. The director also underlined the common origin of the two institutions, as their collections were based on the solidarity of international artists. In fact, between June and July of 1978, artists from Poland donated to the Museum of Resistance, and were as well exhibited in the art museum in Lodz. In December of 1978, there was a Polish exhibition of its donations to the museum in the Galería Centro de Arte Internacional in Cuba, in Havana. And in January of 1980, there was an exhibition of Chilean arpilleras, traditional kind of sewing done by women in Chile at a gallery in Warsaw. So at the end of this very short and exploratory research, I think there are several questions that appear. For example, if we look at the list of the donations and at the centers where the artworks were collected, why were the Bulgarian artworks sent to the Cuban collection and not to the Polish one, which apparently was the most important among the Eastern European countries? And then how were formed and what explains the transnational constellations between Chile and the socialist countries? Was it rather personal ties between artists, curators, and art critics than ideology, as one would expect? Thank you.